this is where we get into the shameless self-promotion, but this current project builds somewhat on my previous book, Textual Warfare and the Making of Methodism, in which I examine the ways in which Methodist belief, practice, doctrine, as well as public perception of the revival in the 18th century was forged in the crucible of public disputation, and specifically the writings by the Methodists as well as the writings by their critics. And as I worked on this project, I only scratched the surface of the periodical literature that addresses Methodism, and particularly popular literary criticism, which developed in the 18th century, first via the Monthly Review in 1749, and then 7 years later by the Critical Review. These were by far the most influential journals devoted to literary criticism in the 18th century, and for some notable reasons. There were a handful of journals devoted to literary criticism prior to the advent of the Monthly and Critical, but these journals typically confined their reviews to what they described as the works of the learned. So they were relatively narrow in their focus. And most literary reviewing up until the Monthly and the Critical consisted of abstract and summary. So the Monthly and Critical were distinct in at least two respects. One is their scope. They set out to review every newly published book that came off British presses. They weren't successful, but that was the goal. So that included intellectual, sophisticated publications, as well as what we would call Grub Street productions, which explains why much of the anti-Methodist literature, as well as the pro-Methodist literature, appears in these review journals. And then the second thing that they did is they began to incorporate critical commentary alongside the summaries and extracts. So their objective in part was to define a set of literary and rhetorical standards to which they could apply to the works that were coming off British presses. So that when I began this study, the question that the big question that I started with is what happened to the pro and anti-Methodist literature when it was filtered through the critical apparatus of the review essay. Okay, and before I get into some of my findings, let me just give you a sense of, and I apologize, these images are a little small and maybe hard to read, but let me just give you a sense of the format of the review journals. Both of them began with the section of a relatively handful of reviews that were referred to as main articles. These were relatively substantive reviews that ran for several pages, sometimes even into later issues of the journal. By far the biggest section of the journals was what they referred to as their monthly catalog of books. And this section of the journal consisted of short reviews that could be no more than a sentence or two to a handful of paragraphs. Most of the reviews of pro and anti-Methodist, literature were of this second type. There are some notable exceptions that you might not be able to make out on the left there, but that's a review of the third part of Bishop Lavington's The Enthusiasm of the Methodist and Papists Compared. Bishop Warburton's Doctrine of Grace was also reviewed as a main article. And then Richard Graves' anti-Methodist novel, The Spiritual Quixote, also received a lengthier treatment. But again, most of the reviews appeared in what they referred to as the monthly catalog. And again, that's hard to make out, but they divided the monthly catalog into sections or categories or types or genres. And one of the categories was what they described as religious and controversial. And so a lot of the polemical literature appeared in those sections. So what did I learn? What did I take away from this study? And as someone who's trained in literary studies, obviously part of my interest was in what this would tell me about literary criticism, as popular literary criticism as it develops in the 18th century. And most literary historians generalize that the monthly and critical shared many of the same critical sensibilities, but they diverged in some of their socio-political commitments. The monthly review was founded by a man named Ralph Griffiths, who was a dissenter and had Whig sensibilities. And so many of the reviews tend to skew in that direction. They tend to be a little bit more liberal in their orientation, where the critical tends to be quite a bit more conservative. And I'll try and illustrate some of the specific ways that's true. The other thing that I learned as I was going through these reviews is that the concept of fair and impartial, which were crucial to both journals, when they defined their objective, they insisted that what they were going to give the public were what they described as fair and impartial reviews. That is, objective, unbiased reviews that focused on literary merit and were void of reviewer opinion and bias. What my studies suggest is that was an ideal that they aspired to, but seldom achieved. And by extension, this gives us an opportunity to critique the idea of critical and rational discourse. For this audience, you might be more interested in what my studies suggest about Methodism, anti-Methodism, and maybe religion more broadly speaking in the 18th century. And while the reviewers tended to be mostly critical of the revival, their response to the revival in the Methodists was much more nuanced than most of the anti-Methodist literature suggests. They weren't unequivocal in declaiming against the Methodists, and oftentimes their opinions were qualified and contingent, often on literary issues, but sometimes on socio-political ones as well. And so what this suggests to me is that the idea of anti-Methodism in the 18th century can't be relegated to a single and homogeneous category, any more than Methodism can. Just as there were Methodisms in the 18th century, there were various strains of the anti-Methodist literature, and I'll try and illustrate that in just a moment. Another point that the study suggests is that religion and religious debate figure prominently during the Enlightenment. Now, for at least 2 decades now, I think religious historians have made a pretty good case that the Enlightenment hardly signaled the death knell of religion, that religion and religious debate in particular were critical to the Enlightenment project. And I think my study reinforces some of these claims. And then finally, I make the contention that the Monthly and Critical may have done more than any other publication or collection of publications to make Methodism a going concern in the 18th century. And I like to liken the reviews to movie trailers, right? I mean, most of us probably see a lot more movie trailers than actual movies. And those trailers give us a sense of what movies are about. And I think the same is true of most readers in the 18th century. A reader in the 18th century might not have ever picked up an anti-Methodist publication or even a pro-Methodist publication. But if they were aware of and read the Monthly or Critical Review, which were published in very large numbers and were among the most popular journals of the period, they would have encountered the ideas that were being espoused in those particular kinds of texts. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples. As you might expect, Wesley and Whitefield were often, their writings, which were reviewed in the review journals, they were often associated with the enthusiasm that for lots of folks defined the revival. So these are 2 sermons, one by Wesley, one by Whitefield. And you can see from these short reviews that Wesley and Whitefield were not reviewed in a very favorable sense. Okay, but if you contrast these reviews with some of the others, you start to see where the reviewers' opinions were often qualified and contingent. So both review journals were antagonistic toward Calvinist points of view. And so what this means is Wesley's writings on or against predestination and election were typically reviewed fairly favorably. So this tract on the left, the Church of England Vindicated from the Charge of Absolute Predestination. It was an anonymously published tract that the critical attributed to Wesley. This letter in style and manner very much resembles the productions of Mr. John Wesley. It is a shrewd and sensible performance. So in one review, he can be portrayed as an enthusiast, and in another one, he is a shrewd and sensible writer. And then Whitefield, both journals concurred that he was in fact a flaming enthusiast, but they also concurred that he was an honest enthusiast, that he was sincere in his ministry. And this is different than a lot of anti-Methodist critiques that accused Whitefield of personally profiting from his evangelical activities. So you see some of the discrepancies in the reviews. Nowhere are the political differences between the two journals more evident than in the reviews of Wesley's A Calm Address to Our American Colonies and his other writings at the time of the American Revolution, and the responses that those publications garnered. So Caleb Evans was the most prolific of Wesley's antagonists on this issue. And as you might expect, in the more liberal-leaning monthly, Caleb Evans' publications were reviewed relatively favorably, whereas in the critical, they were viewed not so much. And you can see from those short reviews. And then the final example, some of you might be familiar with Christopher Ansie's The New Bath Guide. This is a collection of epistolary poems written by a fictional family of quality describing their visit to Bath. Okay, and both review journals reviewed the collection of poems rather favorably, with the same exception. And that is the letter that is penned by a young woman named Prudence, who describes her, being visited in a dream by a young Methodist preacher that she's encountered at Bath, and it describes her conversion in, well, let's just say, somewhat eroticized language. That is, her conversion is likened to a sexual experience. Okay, and both journals were highly critical of this way of satirizing the Methodists, both in this piece as well as in other pieces that would satirically suggest that Methodists conflated spiritual and sexual feelings. So this is an instance where the monthly and critical's fidelity to their critical standards kind of trumped their impulse to criticize the Methodists. Now, one thing you'll see in the critical's review, where it says the scene suggests some ideas which in point of delicacy we cannot applaud, the critical is more likely than the monthly to tack on this caveat like this. Yet we are inclined to excuse the facetious author when we consider that some of the mysteries of enthusiasm are reported upon good authority. So if you're wondering which of the two review journals was harder on the Methodists, it was usually the critical that tended to be the one that, even if they were critical of an author's method, they would find a way to reinforce the message. Just in closing, let me just give you a sense of how the book is outlined. This is the table of contents. So chapter 1 looks at popular review criticism, Methodism, and the idea of the public sphere. If you're familiar with Habermas, he actually has quite a bit to say about literary and art criticism, and how it was how literary and art criticism were kind of precursors to political debate. That it was the British public kind of cut their teeth on talking about art and literature before they moved on to issues like economics and politics. But he has relatively little to say about religion. In fact, religion doesn't factor into the public sphere he describes. He associates religion more with a private than a public sphere. So part of what I do in this chapter is reinforce what Habermas has to say about literary criticism, but then suggest that religious debate figured more prominently in the formation of a public sphere than Habermas suggests. Chapter 2 focuses on reviews of religious and polemical texts. And chapter 3 focuses specifically on reviews of writings by, but also about Wesley and Whitefield. Okay, they, of course, as the leaders of the movement, they received a fair bit of attention. Chapter 4 focuses on belletristic critique, that is, reviews of what I would refer to as literature proper, poetry, poems, prose, plays, and other experimental types. And then in chapter 5, I focus on two fairly important events in the history of early Methodism: the Oxford expulsion in 1768, when 6 students at the University of Oxford were expelled for their ties to Methodism, and specifically the Calvinist arm of the Methodist movement. And then the Minutes controversy, which following Whitfield's death in 1770, Whitfield reasserted an earlier proposition that Methodism leaned too much toward Calvinism, which spawned a debate between Calvinist and West Methodist. And both of these events played out in the public and simultaneously in the review journals, who reported on these debates in real time, or as close to real time as 18th century printing technology allowed. So in some respects, they played the part of a newspaper reporting on the debates, but at the same time, they editorialized. They took sides in these debates. And then finally, I look at the legacy of the monthly and critical reviews, looking at some of the copycat journals that grew up in the wake of the monthly and critical. And all of these journals started by criticizing the monthly and critical for not achieving their aim of offering fair and impartial reviews. And then they proceeded to offer, well, not fair and impartial reviews themselves. And that chapter concludes by actually looking at literary reviewing within Methodism, and specifically within the Gospel magazine. And I focus on the Gospel magazine because the Gospel magazine was the most self-conscious about imitating the kind of reviewing that we see in the monthly and critical. If you've looked at the Arminian magazine, you know that Wesley included excerpts and abstracts from a good many publications. And that, to be sure, is a kind of reviewing. But he typically focused on older out-of-print publications, not current ones, whereas the Gospel magazine did. And the Gospel magazine incorporated critical commentary alongside the excerpts and summaries. Now, what the Gospel magazine did is they acknowledged from the outset that they were going to be biased, that they had no intention of offering fair and impartial reviews. And the argument I make is that they found a more authentic and genuine form of reviewing and resolved some of the concerns that kind of plagued the mainstream literary journals. So with that, I wish again to express my appreciation for being here and open it up to